You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
Hey, Marlene, welcome back to On the Way Home. We're so excited to have you join us again today. And before we jump in, because we've had you on the show before, I'll ask you to share with us in one word what home means to you.
Home to me, well, I'm going to take two words, Emmy, is safe and nurturing. Those are the two things that really come to mind when I think about home.
Amazing. So for our listeners, I'll just share that Marlene has agreed to come on the podcast today to discuss the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario's report, an update on subsidized housing programs. So thank you so much for agreeing to do that. When I saw the report and I thought about how impactful it would be to unpack and understand the report, I thought about you and your leadership in the Ontario space. And so thanks so much for joining for this. One of the report's most striking findings is that more than 1 million Ontario households are now estimated to need subsidized housing. What does that number tell us about the state of housing affordability in Ontario today?
I'm just going to take a step back and do a little context setting as we talk about community housing for our listeners here in affordable housing. Our membership at ONPHA is indicative of the community housing space. So that includes independent not-for-profits, local housing corporations, and supportive housing, as well as service managers who are our partners with the province and the federal governments in funding this system. And so when we start to think about that framing, what that means is that the province of Ontario that issued this report, they came out of a fiscal year running a $5.5 billion deficit. And some of the drivers behind that deficit, if we want to understand sort of the core drivers behind some of that deficit, the shortfall was driven by healthcare expenditures, as well as children and social services. And so the reason I mention that is because there's intrinsic connectedness between or among the levels of government and us as a community housing sector. And so if you start to roll that down and look at the municipal governments who are our largest partner, we also know that they have identified through AMO, their Association of Municipalities Ontario, that we need to spend $11 billion over the next 10 years just to fund community housing to the level that it needs to be. And if you boil that down even further, they've identified that they need to spend $2 billion simply to respond to homelessness and encampments. And in the report, we also read that the demand or the growth in this particular area is about 8%. So when we talk about cause and effect and relationships, it's really important to understand that we're all in this together. And so to bring this to the community housing view, I would say that we know in Ontario, a third of households are renting. We know that a system that was built decades ago was geared towards housing about 20% of those who are at the bottom of the income ladder. And what has changed, and what we're seeing in this report, is that pressure is now impacting middle income earners and hitting about 50% of the population. So we have an environment where there's an incredible interconnectedness and a lot of pressures at all levels of government, including our funding partners and then the community housing sector that actually delivers the service.
So the report also projects that housing need will continue to grow through 2027, despite the increased investment and new programs. Why are we seeing demand outpace the solutions currently being put in place?
Well, a little bit of that response is due to what I just mentioned around some of those pockets of pressures and the system that we work in. So what I'll add to your question here is that we know that governments tend to work in silos, whether it's ministries or across governments. There are efforts to do a better job at integrating different funding envelopes and really looking at a system and system performance. But what we're seeing in that is that the reporting or the results don't always line up to where the funding envelope is coming from. And that's where there's a miss sometimes when we start to think about things like inflation. Are we just keeping up with the basics of inflation when we look at commitments to funding programs and deliverables that are expected of the community housing sector? And so what that does to us and really highlights that in many ways we're working against the headwinds, in that it is very difficult to keep up on a tax base that really comes from property taxation.
So the National Housing Strategy has led to significant growth in programs like the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit. From ONPHA's perspective, what impact have these newer programs had, and where is there still opportunity?
Yeah, so the National Housing Strategy was new when it first rolled out, which was about 8 years ago, and we're heading into the tail end of that strategy that we're looking forward to a renewal, should that happen. And so what that means is that at our sector association, we actually looked at and tried to measure how impactful was the strategy here in Ontario. Where did we have wins? Where did we have losses? Or where is there more work to be done? And so we ourselves built out a 10-year housing plan that we can measure against our plan and how that behaved within the National Housing Strategy. So what I can tell you is that our goal, almost 10 years ago, was to build 69,000 affordable housing units as part of a response to the National Housing Strategy. And that's just in the Ontario context, so I will mention that. And what we discovered is we actually did quite well in achieving 100% of our target in commitments. And I do want to underscore the difference between funds that have actually flowed and resulted in real new development versus commitments towards that new development, because we know, of course, that building and construction is a long-term process. When we look at creating supportive housing units, we also had a target there for growth. And there we were aiming to achieve 30,000 new units. So you put the two together and you get close to 99,000 units. We made some progress on achieving the target for supportive housing commitments under the National Housing Strategy. The other important thing to really acknowledge is that while we are growth oriented and interested in new supply, it's also really, really important to protect the assets that we have and make sure that we can repair and renew those assets, so we protect the asset base. So in that case, we had a target of 260,000 community-owned rental homes. That was our target to repair and renew. And as a province, we did really well there, again, on funding commitments to reach that target. The area that we saw the least success in terms of a response on funding was actually around income supports and supportive housing supportive housing funding, where we see a lot of pressure. And so I can share with you that we, as a collective, federal, provincial, and community housing sector, we only achieved about 20% of that target. So there was some movement, but definitely more work needed around housing supports and supportive housing.
So the 69,000 you mentioned is specifically for Ontario?
Yes. And just to take a little sidestep, Ontario is really big in the national context. So when you look at our stock as compared to the rest of the country, Ontario itself has half of the community housing stock of all of Canada. And so we have a really big voice. We have a strong voice. We have targets that just for our own province could, surpass a national target. And part of our work at ONPHA is to ensure that Ontario is getting its fair share, if you will, and that we work with our partners to make sure that we can build more supply, so achieve those housing targets, but also protect what we have in terms of the assets that have already been built and paid for and invested in. We don't want to be moving backwards on that. And then this new theme that we see coming out of our membership is really the need for funding supportive housing and those housing providers with supports.
You talked about the target. What about the demand for that housing as well? Would you say it, like, the numbers reach that level as well?
Well, so what we're reading in the report that was just published by the province of Ontario is that the growth, even for next year up until 2027, is another 8%. So when you start to stack some of these challenges on top of each other in terms of we're on a fixed property tax base that generates the tax supported dollars. We have governments that are running deficits and don't have endless amounts of money, but have to make priorities and choose where they're investing their money. We have community housing providers that are having to decide between operating and capital dollars and how are they funding those supports for people inside buildings. And then on top of that, you compound interest rates and inflation and many, many other factors. And so my big message is that we are in a system and we are in it together, and that community housing is part of the solution. We are part of the housing continuum, but we are not the only part to be considering. And so the better we can do at speaking to our interest holders and navigating these challenges to get together, the better we'll be able to find that system performance that really maximizes the use of the public dollar, if you will, and invest in long-term sustainable affordable housing so that we can get back to the 20% and not having to really be challenged by some steep cost of living issues.
The report notes that municipalities continue to shoulder the largest share of subsidized housing costs. What challenges does that create for local communities trying to meet the growing housing needs?
Right. So we do have also that came out in the summary of the report we're talking about today, Emmy, is the shift of the role of the municipality as compared to federal and provincial governments. And so what we've seen over 10 plus years is that the proportion of money that is being generated by that local tax base at the local level has increased as compared to the investments made by federal and provincial governments. And of course, what that means is municipalities are growth oriented. They're generating their revenues off property taxes, which are essentially fixed. They are often not keeping up with inflation. And so what happens there is there really is increasing pressure on the municipality and the squeeze on the municipality that forces choices, but also speaks to inefficiencies across the greater system where we're all trying to solve the same problem. And the more that we can do to achieve efficiencies in a system performance approach, there is money to be saved in other pockets of upper levels of government.
While the number of households receiving rent supplements is expected to increase, the number of rent geared to income units and below market rental units is projected to decline. What concerns does that raise for the future of deeply affordable housing?
So there's a choice. We know that community housing is a proven model that delivers long-term affordability at the community level. And investing in the community housing sector will guarantee that that affordability is baked in long-term. What happens when we start to move towards a model that is more mobile, where the subsidy or the support goes with the household as opposed to the housing provider, then those dollars move around the marketplace. And what that means is it's not an investment in social infrastructure. It is simply a support to a household. And so we firmly believe that investing in community housing as part of social infrastructure is a good long-term investment for affordability at the community level. There's all kinds of research to back the economic impact of investing in community housing, as well as the savings that comes with every dollar spent over here has a long-term knock-on greater savings downstream for other supports.
A big theme in the report is that some newer programs are expanding while legacy supports are expiring. Are we actually growing Ontario's subsidized housing system fast enough, or are we mostly replacing what's being lost right now?
So short answer, no. We are not keeping up with demand, and that is a symptom of more complex, deeper rooted issues that are not simply about community housing. So we don't work in isolation. There is a system of supports as a philosophy, whether we're talking federal or provincial or local governments, in social infrastructure. And so maintaining our stock that we've already invested in, being able to have enough revenue or reserves in place to achieve some of the growth in the housing targets is a choice. And then, of course, being able to keep up with some of these inflationary pressures and system performance pressures is a real challenge. So our members, our sector does an extremely good job of protecting long-term housing affordability and delivering quality products at the community level that will last, will have that impact. We know that we use those dollars very efficiently. We also know that we're part of the solution, but we are not the only solution. We are part of the housing continuum. And what we essentially want to have is a housing system that performs as a whole. So we want people to be able to move along the continuum and have choice as life changes, and that people don't have to stop forever in community housing because the stretch into the market is so big that there is no chance of having that kind of household income to make the move. So it's a multifaceted challenge and it's a multifaceted response, but really when you boil it down, it's not that complicated, because we know the community housing system works very well and we're good at what we do, and we partner very well with the private sector as well. So big shout out to anyone who's interested. Please reach out to ONPHA, the Sector Association, and we're happy to connect you with the right folks.
That's super helpful. So for any of the listeners who aren't in touch yet or aren't a member, please do visit the ONPHA website and familiarize yourself with this network. It's an important network in achieving our housing goals and partnering where we need to do so. So Marlene, a few more questions about the report. Thank you for sharing with us. So the report estimates that hundreds of thousands of households in need either receive no support at all or receive support that is insufficient to make housing affordable. What does this gap mean for housing providers and the people that they serve?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question for not a whole lot of time here today. And um, I hinted at this a little bit in terms of the housing continuum and the system that was designed to be a flow through. The system was social infrastructure to flow people through when they needed it. What has happened is the marketplace has inflated beyond what a household or an individual in a household can achieve in terms of stretching into market or even low end of market housing. And so that means that there's a lot of demand on our part of the rental housing continuum. And it means that people aren't moving. And so there are choices to be made from the housing provider perspective, which lives in those streams of keep the asset in good repair so that we're housing people well. Provide those supports where we can to make sure that people are successful in their tenancy, and then being able to grow and add to the housing supply as part of a portfolio. When you look at the knock-on impact on the individual tenant inside one of those units, we're always talking about units, they also have choices, right? So if your household income is stretched, you're going to have to choose between rent and food or daycare or a bus pass or whatever that is. And so this is where we see that all of us are part of a system. There can be additional pressure added into downstream costs. So we know when people are not successfully housed, there are additional costs that hit social services, healthcare, and justice services. And those become really expensive parts of the social system that are also supported through tax dollars. And so a little, method to the work that we're doing is we do want to talk about system performance so that we're investing hard-earned dollars over here to build in long-term sustainable housing so that we can take pressure off the downstream costs that are way more expensive for governments to support.
Right. So when you look specifically at the nonprofit housing sector, what role would you see that nonprofit housing providers play in addressing these challenges, and how can they be successful?
Well, we have three primary goals. We want to build and be part of the supply solution. We want to protect the assets that we have, and we want to support the people that are running these organizations as well as inside the buildings. And so what becomes central to much of this is really understanding where we're putting capital dollars and operating dollars. We know there is considerable pressure on operating dollars, and we're hearing from our members that the supports that are needed with increasingly complex tenant-related issues is a challenge for the community housing sector. And so they, as a membership base, will ensure that their core service is protected and they do it well. And if we want to have a bigger role in growing housing supply and being part of the solution, what that means then is more investment or different ways of stacking capital in order to achieve that new growth is where our membership will be focusing. We have some really, really creative high-performing members in the community housing sector here in Ontario that are doing some really good work with building their own stock, essentially creating a system for themselves by getting into mixed-use development. So we see that some of our members are actually building market housing or slightly below market housing in order to generate the cash to offset some of the subsidies in other parts of their portfolio. And they are solving their problem. And it is coming out of urgency and commitment to the mandate to deliver that affordability at the community housing level. We also see some really interesting work happening with the healthcare sector, and how healthcare and housing are very closely linked in terms of success over here will result in success over here as well. And so we've seen some really interesting partnerships in the community housing sector with healthcare, where we're recognizing that investment in supportive housing is saving big dollars in the healthcare system and clearing up emergency rooms and beds in hospitals because of that interconnectedness. So stability and long-term funding is key for us so that we can keep doing our job.
And that might be a perfect segue. If you could identify one priority that you would ask governments to focus on over the next few years to strengthen Ontario's community housing system, what would it be and why?
I would say that working with the community housing sector to actually shape and design policy will have a long-term impact in terms of the system that we're building. So something that I didn't mention is that our sector is coming out of 30-year funding commitments, which have been tied to mortgages. Those mortgages are being paid off and our funding programs are being renegotiated. And so while we're coming out of 30-year legacy funding, what it also means is we're now looking at the next 30 years in terms of what do we do next. And we have very good ideas with a proven track record of what we can do and how we can perform as a system within that. So the better we do at developing good public policy and investing in community housing, the better that our communities will do long-term over the next 30 years and whatever we build now for later.
There's a lot in that report. Let's say there's a lot of opportunity to work through. So what gives you hope right now when you look at the housing space and all that there is to be done?
Well, what I can share with you, Emmy, is when I came into this role, before this role, I'm just going to pause for a moment. Before this role, in my work in economic development, which was solely focused on commercial and industrial development, I did not have the development community coming to me talking about housing or affordable housing. And in the last number of years, 8, 9, 10 years, somewhere in there, that I've been with ONPHA now, what I have seen is a really uptick in the interest in building housing, whether it's market housing or below market or subsidized, deeply affordable housing. And so what gives me hope is that housing has become a central issue. It is a central issue of all levels of government, and it is a central issue to all parties. And so what we have achieved in that is actually the golden position of being relevant as we're developing those public policies and the programs and the funding that comes with it to build the system that we want for the next 30 years. And because we're coming out of current mortgages and funding arrangements and negotiating the new service agreements, we're actually using a business model to negotiate those funding futures. And we are behaving in a much more business-oriented perspective, which is building out a sustainable model. So that gives me hope that we have learned, we know, and we perform, and we're now making the plan for the next 30 years. And our members are in it right now. It's real and it's happening.
Golden position. I love it. You heard it here. We're in a golden position in the housing space. And I think for listeners who are in Ontario and are not yet part of the ONPHA movement, you should consider joining, I think. And we speak often of how much there needs to be done in the space. And I think the more that we collaborate and raise one voice, the easier it is to move change, and to drown out any chaos that can occur and to bring forward solutions. Because I think everyone wants to do right. Like everyone wants to do right by Canadian citizens, by Ontarians, and so how can we move that needle together? Thank you so much, Marlene, for joining the show today, for sharing about this report, and for your hopeful position and all that you're doing in the space. It is greatly appreciated and admired.
Well, thank you for the time and the profile. Best of luck.
Take care.
Bye.
Today's episode featured Marlene Coffey, CEO of ONPHA, who joined On the Way Home to unpack the findings of the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario's latest report on subsidized housing programs. The conversation explored the growing gap between housing need and available supports and the evolving role of rent supplements, the importance of preserving deeply affordable housing, and the critical contribution of nonprofit housing providers across the province. While the report highlights significant challenges ahead, it also points to opportunities for governments, communities, and housing organizations to strengthen Ontario's affordable housing system for the future. Thank you for listening to On the Way Home. Stay tuned for more conversations exploring the ideas, policies, and people shaping the future of housing across Canada.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.